Welcome back to another video about IB environmental systems and societies. Today's topic is 2.4 biomes, zonation, and succession. And in this video, I'm only going to focus on the first part of the topic, biomes. So we'll follow up with a couple of other videos on zonation and succession. The first big idea in topic 2.4 is that the climate determines the type of biome found in a particular area. The primary factors that make that determination is the combination of temperature and precipitation. And those result from combinations of incoming sunlight and wind patterns. We'll explain how those happen in a little bit. This diagram you see here is called a Whittaker biome diagram. You'll see it a couple more times in this topic. A couple of quick definitions to get started. First are aquatic biomes. These, of course, are water-based biomes, and they generally fall into two categories. That's freshwater or saltwater or marine, right? So in this global map here, in this kind of aqua or teal color, you have the lakes and rivers. Those are your freshwater ecosystems. Then in estuaries, which is where rivers flow into the ocean, you get a combination of both freshwater and saltwater in a term that we call brackish water. Those estuaries have a kind of a mixed characteristics of freshwater and saltwater biomes. Then in the ocean, our saltwater biomes consist of the intertidal zones, which is inter meaning between tides. So the zones between low tide and high tide right at your coastlines. The coral reefs, which you can see distributed in this little purple color at various places throughout the tropics around the world. Then the oceanic pelagic zone is this massive area of pale blue. That's the open ocean. And then these dark blue zones called the abyssal zones, an abyss or a deep trench in the oceans. This is where the ocean is quite deep and you have very, very dark conditions and very high pressure conditions. We'll discuss that in a little bit more detail when we go through the limiting factors for each biome around the world. The other type of biomes that you should know about, and which most people think about, are terrestrial biomes. Terrestrial simply means they're land-based. And you wouldn't be expected to know this map in this degree of detail, but a few things that are some kind of broad patterns that you should know about. This dark green zone that you find here in South America, in Africa, and across all of the islands in Asia, this is a band of your tropical rainforest. So their distribution is fairly standard. Here at the northernmost point of our terrestrial map, this pale color here is the tundra. So you find it all across northern Asia, a little bit in northern Europe, and in Canada and the United States, in North America. And this dark band here is the taiga or coniferous forest. That kind of distribution pattern is pretty broad, and you should be able to recognize those on maps. As I mentioned earlier, the aquatic biomes, those are water-based. Forest biomes, there are kind of three main ones that you should study for ESS. On the screen here, what you see is the taiga or a coniferous forest, which is found in cold climates. You'll also find temperate deciduous forest, which are found in temperate climate zones between the poles and the tropics. Those forests typically have 4 seasons: winter, spring, summer, and fall. And so the plants will go through varying degrees of productivity during those seasons. And then the main forest that a lot of people will already be familiar with are tropical rainforests, which I described in previous slide, being found in a band around the equator across the globe. Grasslands, in North America, we tend to call these prairies. In Central Asia, they're called steppes, S-T-E-P-P-E-S. And you'll notice they are characterized by grasses and few, if any, trees. Deserts, relatively clear, low productivity. They tend to be found, but are not always found, on the western side of continents. And then, of course, here's the tundra that I mentioned previously, also relatively treeless because it's so cold and because of the permafrost soil, roots can't penetrate it. So you get these very low-growing, really tough plants. On this screen, I suggest that you pause the video and go through these limiting factors in these types of biomes and make a note of them. It is quite possible that you'll be asked to analyze or describe the different limiting factors across a range of biomes on your ESS exam. So take a moment and do that. Let's review these limiting factors. In aquatic biomes, because water absorbs some of the incoming light, that limits the amount of photosynthesis because there's less light available for photosynthesis to happen. In the deep oceans, those abyssal zones that we saw on the map earlier, there is no light, so no photosynthesis happens, which means they have very low levels of productivity. And in some freshwater biomes, particularly near the polar climate zones, they'll freeze in winter. And because things are frozen, that slows down chemical reactions. And so that limits photosynthesis, as does the limited sunlight during the polar winters. Forests, here you'll note TRF, that stands for tropical rainforest. So in these three notes here, tropical rainforest generally have all of their nutrients locked in the biomass. So their nutrients are locked in the trunks of those massive trees that we find in tropical rainforest. Because of the near daily rainfall that tropical rainforests have, there is a lot of water percolating downwards through the soil, and that tends to leach nutrients from upper layers of the soil down to lower layers of the soil where they're less available for plants. That limits productivity. And the soils also tend to be rather thin because of the very high rates of decomposition and nutrient uptake by rapidly growing trees and other plants. In temperate forest, where you have 4 seasons of the year, during the winters typically are colder and drier. And both of those factors will also limit photosynthesis. And anytime you limit photosynthesis, you limit the productivity. Grasslands tend to be found in drier areas than forests, but they get more precipitation than deserts because they're found in the center of continents, right, which is a concept called continentality. They tend to have very cold winters and very hot summers, and those extremes are difficult for a lot of plant species to cope with, so that limits their productivity. And they have relatively low rates of decomposition and nutrient cycling compared to forests. Deserts, I think it's relatively obvious that because there is little precipitation, there's not much water to support a lot of photosynthesis. So the combination of low precipitation and high evaporation means water is your primary limiting factor in deserts. Deserts also typically have extreme day-night temperature changes, cold nights, extraordinarily hot days, and those extremes are difficult for plants that are not highly specialized for those conditions to survive. The tundra, kind of like the winters in temperate forest, during winters they have very short days, very long nights, the temperatures are quite cold, and all that combination limits a lot of photosynthesis and productivity. And because during the winter, the ground may become frozen or may be buried under snow, you tend to have very slow nutrient cycling. So decomposition happens quite slowly, which means the release of nutrients to new plant growth also happens quite slowly. In the previous slide, it was talking about a lot about productivity. So you're going to see that this kind of follows along on the same premise. Again, I recommend you pause the video and make some notes. Aquatic biomes, your marine biomes in particular, your tropical coral reefs, because they're found in shallow, warm waters that receive a lot of year-round sunlight, tend to have very high degrees of productivity. Again, the deep oceans, because of the limited light, have very low productivity. And your temperate freshwater biomes, like your lakes and your rivers, are somewhere in the middle. Tropical rainforests, no surprise, have extraordinarily high productivity because plant growth happens year-round. Because you have warm temperatures year-round, you have nearly daily rainfall year-round. So there's plenty of light and water to feed into the photosynthesis process. Temperate rainforests also have high productivity, but that tends to be limited to the spring and summer when the days are becoming longer and plants are sending all of their new growth out. So during the autumn and winter, when days become shorter and temperatures drop, their productivity falls. Grasslands have moderate to low productivity. A lot of biomass, but the nutrient cycles are slow. And again, those seasonal temperature extremes between very cold winters and very hot summers limit the types of plants that can grow. So in the grasslands during autumn and winter, those plants will go into a dormant stage, which a lot of people call dieback. And the plants may not actually die; they just go dormant and they stop photosynthesizing until the days become longer and the temperatures become warm enough for photosynthesis to happen. Deserts clearly have very low productivity, again because of the limited water and the temperature extremes. And tundra typically has pretty low productivity, again because very short winter days, very cold winter temperatures, and then during the summer months, as the snow melts from the winter, you have a lot of waterlogging in the soil. That means that the water is saturated and there's not enough atmosphere available. The third way you might be asked to compare and contrast the different biomes is through their biodiversity levels. And you'll see this is connected to the productivity of these different biomes. So coral reefs, high productivity, high biodiversity. Deep oceans, low productivity, low biodiversity. And your temperate freshwater biomes, because you have moderate degrees of productivity, you also have moderate levels of biodiversity. Forests across the world tend to have very high biodiversity. Tropical rainforests have the highest biodiversity per square meter of any biome on the planet. You should remember that fact. Temperate forests, those deciduous forests found in the mid-latitudes, have the second highest biodiversity on the planet. Grasslands, despite having low to moderate productivity levels, actually have high biodiversity levels because they have a very diverse range of plants that flower rapidly during the growing season. And those flowering plants supply a lot of nutrients and energy for primary consumers, such as insects and other invertebrates, which then support a pretty wide range of secondary consumers, such as birds. Desert biodiversity, no surprise, because of the very low levels of productivity in the desert, you have low biodiversity levels. You tend to have very short food chains or food webs in the desert because there's very limited productivity. So there's not as much energy to go into that ecological pyramid of trophic levels to support a lot of different life forms. And again, the tundra also has limited biodiversity because of the temperature extremes. You have very few amphibians, reptiles, or invertebrates because they're cold-blooded. They can't survive the winter. So in the tundra, you tend to have a higher concentration of mammals and birds because they are warm-blooded. This slide explains how the different amounts of incoming sunlight affect the distribution of biomes around the world. This giant arrow here on the right represents all of the sunlight falling on Earth, and the two smaller arrows represent rays of light encapsulating the same amount of energy. Here at the equator, all of that energy is distributed across roughly 1,000 square kilometers. But because of the tilt of our planet, that sunlight is distributed over a much wider or larger area of the surface of Earth. So the same amount of energy is dispersed more thinly across the surface of the planet. That means that per unit area, there is less sunlight falling on the polar zones than there is in the tropical zones. Less sunlight, of course, affects temperature. So warmer temperatures in the tropics, colder temperatures in the polar zones. Those temperatures of the planet's surface affect the temperature of the atmosphere, and that also affects the precipitation that's available in any part of the world. This is another way of visualizing the differences in sunlight, precipitation, and temperature around the world. On this right side of the triangle, we have annual precipitation. Across the bottom, we have the humidity, or the amount of moisture suspended in the atmosphere. And then along the left side, we have the evapotranspiration ratio, kind of how much water is lost to evaporation and transpiration. Here along the left side, where we have very low humidity levels, all desert stuff. And over on the far right, where we have very high humidity levels, rainforest, 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 rain tundra, right? So high humidity tends to correspond with high levels of precipitation. The tricellular model of Earth's atmosphere explains how biomes are distributed among the three main climate zones of tropical, temperate, and polar. Right? It's called tricellular because it means there are three main cells. You should memorize these. The first is the polar cells, which, as you might guess, because they're located at the poles, circulate very cold air. Cold air doesn't have a lot of kinetic energy. It cannot hold a whole lot of moisture, so it tends to be very dry air. The feral cells in the mid latitudes or the temperate zones, right, they typically circulate air with moderate temperatures, which means they also can hold moderate amounts of moisture. That's why the temperate biomes tend to have moderate amounts of precipitation. The precipitation might happen pretty regularly, once a month, once every couple of weeks. It might happen seasonally, where it's more concentrated in spring and summer, but there are moderate amounts of precipitation. And then the Hadley cells are the ones that occur right around Earth's equator. Those are your tropical circulation areas. And because it's the tropics, it's warm. Warm air can hold a lot more water because the air particles are moving around faster. They have more energy. Therefore, they tend to have a lot more moisture. They hold more moisture, and that's why it rains more frequently. We can't talk about the way that climate is responsible for the distribution of biomes without recognizing that a changing climate changes the distribution of biomes around the world. This map on the right shows the projected change in biome distribution on the African continent from 2008 up through the start of the 22nd century, right, and the difference that you find between them. Right? So you might want to take a few moments, pause the video, and just look at the colors down here. Right? So looking at the number of trees, we've got the total number of grasses and the change in those. Right? That means that our biomes are going to shift or move around the planet as the climate changes, because the combination of temperature and precipitation in different parts of the world is going to change as the climate changes. On your ESS exam, you may be asked to explain the distribution, structure, biodiversity, and relative productivity of contrasting biomes. You can use this type of a model or the tricellular model to explain that distribution. You might be tasked on an ESS exam to analyze data for a range of biomes. You should be able to describe broadly the kinds of species that are found in each of these areas. So maybe pause again for a few minutes, jot down some of these indicator plant species. Again, these are broad patterns. These are not named species. Again, we're going to come back to climate change and how it impacts biomes. Remember that the distribution of biomes is dictated by climate patterns, particularly sunlight, temperature, and precipitation. The sunlight isn't going to change. Temperature and precipitation patterns will change as climate changes. And because those two factors are the main factors that dictate the distribution of biomes, those are the factors that will impact the way that biomes shift across the surface of our planet as our climate warms. All right, that's it for today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to my channel. If you'd like to find more ESS resources, please head over to my website, mrcreamerscience.com, where you can find some guided notes and additional resources such as other videos about each of the topics.